Welcome to the Women Leaders Association Daily Member Podcast, where we believe we go further, faster, and have more fun when we go together. I'm your host, Julianne Kirkland. And in each Daily Member Podcast, we will pick out a great speaker from one of our meetings that we thought you would enjoy. You can access hundreds of recent speakers, book summaries, great articles, and more at no additional charge through your membership portal. If you would like to get involved in a Women Leaders Association mastermind group or find a networking group near you, or if you just need access to the membership portal, simply go to womenleaderspodcast.com to be connected. Now let's tune in for this incredible message.
All right, everyone. I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Adrienne Dorn, who's the Executive Director of the Greater Minneapolis Council of Churches, is going to be talking with us today about dealing with resistance. Get your team to accept and invest in change. Adrienne has been GMCC's Executive Director since 2018. During that time, she has led a collaborative process to develop a renewed vision and strategic direction that builds upon its 116-year history. She has been leading co-design approaches for programs and initiatives in arts, health, sports, food security, youth development, and social justice with various partners over the last 20 years. Throughout her career, she has held positions in executive leadership, fundraising, board leadership, and consulting. These roles have included working extensively with community-based organizations, institutions, and groups seeking to promote inclusiveness in Minnesota's economic and social life. She holds a BA from Macalester College in St. Paul. Please join me in welcoming Adrienne.
Hi, my name is Adrienne. I am currently the Executive Director of GMCC. We are a multicultural interfaith nonprofit organization, as mentioned, founded 116 years ago as Greater Minneapolis Council of Churches. We've provided a variety of services for our communities over the years, and today we continue to offer immediate relief services while working to effect long-term systemic change. So I now have experience leading two different nonprofit organizations, both at which I catalyzed and led some pretty significant change. The change at the first organization, which is an arts organization, was really about adding and supplementing new and different programming. Not sunsetting anything, not getting rid of things, but really just adding to what was already in place. But the change I forged at the second organization, a social services agency, was much more radical. It included questioning the very existence of the organization, sunsetting programs, venturing into new spaces, basically turning the organization on its head. Now, what's ironic about this is that the change that I forged at the second organization, the more radical change, I was really successful in getting my team to accept and invest in it. But the change I was leading at the arts organization, which again was just supplementing programming, I failed in many ways to get my team to accept and invest in it, which ultimately threw the organization into some level of chaos. So to be a little bit more specific, the change I was driving at the arts organization was really about engaging and centering BIPOC immigrant artists. And this was different than what we were used to doing for a couple of reasons. One is because these artists didn't operate in the same infrastructure than the artists we were used to working with did. So it required different and perhaps more resources to effectively engage them. And second, we were inviting them into kinds of activities and events that we hadn't done previously. Again, requiring different and new approaches in order to effectively do that. But the moment I realized that there was not really an investment in this change was when I had developed and proposed a racial justice framework for the organization. Now, this was prior to the current environment where we seem to be experiencing an increased awareness of racial justice issues. But the response was, Adrienne, we aren't a racial justice organization. We're an arts organization. And it was then that I really realized that the stakeholders weren't invested in the impact and the vision behind this new and now quite substantial programming. They were simply putting up with it. So what was the difference? What was different between the arts organization and the social services agency? Where did I go wrong? What did I get right? So to unpack this question a little bit, I'm going to talk about a few things in this presentation. Oops. I'm going to first just quickly go over types of change. I'm going to talk about considerations that leaders should make when embarking on change. I'm going to talk about approaches or some guidelines to making that change. And finally, some suggested phases to change. So my recommendations for dealing with resistance to change are for dealing with that resistance, but also for avoiding it in the first place. And to do that, I propose leveraging an approach of collective change. When I use the term collective change, I'm referring to a collaborative, iterative process of power sharing and co-designing. And I think that's important, so I'll say it again. It's a collaborative, iterative process of power sharing and co-designing. I'll also note that people often talk about organizations as if they aren't comprised of people and they're not subject to the complex and dynamic challenges facing those people, but really organizations are just a collection of people, right? Personality, identity, interpersonal conflict all play such a huge role in an organization's or business's success. And I just think it's really important for us to remember that when we're talking about embarking on change. So I'll very quickly review what are types of change. What can change look like? Staffing and leadership changes, financial modeling, programming changes, vision and strategy, your location, facility and space, or constituent population, who's involved. So none of these changes operate in silos, of course. They all impact each other, and I'm really talking about all of them. So considerations when it comes to change. I'll just say consideration number one is the change necessary for the sustainability or the mission fulfillment of the organization or business. Now, if you're looking to embark on change and considering the challenges, you've probably already decided that it is, but I still think it's worth pausing to ask that question. Number two, do your staff and stakeholders understand the need for change? You know, part of creating the impetus for change, of course, is to provide data and reasoning to make the team aware of the need for change. So before we can get them to accept or invest in it, we should get them to understand it. But note that it is very possible for people to reject the need for change even after they understand it, or to not be invested in it even after they've accepted it. Team members might logically understand the need for change, but of course, being open to change in the abstract is very different from accepting the change being proposed. So whether or not they're emotionally open to change, it means we should also consider to what degree is your team or your staff and stakeholders invested in the current status of the organization. So you might think about the length of time they've been there. Team members will likely have to adjust their roles or responsibilities to accommodate new or different programming, a new facility, a new team structure. And that might make them uncomfortable because they're probably comfortable. And in fact, some of them will actively just resist change because of that. And in many cases, of course, staff, especially in nonprofits, see their roles as an extension of themselves. And so in a way, when you're introducing change, you're kind of introducing a whole new sense of self, which can often lead to an identity crisis in some ways. I have just a short little story. I once worked with a staff so terrified of change that when I took the initiative to remove some useless office shelving, the shelves were this far apart from each other, nothing was on them. They were just taking up space, so I took them down. And after I removed the shelves, the response was, well, we could have used those to store cassette tapes. And now this was in 2012, and we also were not in possession of any cassette tapes. But there was just such this fear of change in any way that's kind of how it manifested. In consideration number 4, are you as the leader willing to accept the tension between leading collective change and embracing collective change? And this is really important because the reality of being a leader who engages in something like collective change is that you're giving up power. You're giving up authority, you're giving up credit, but you're still holding all of the responsibility. Now, the advantage, of course, is that I'm arguing that the trade-off is that it makes for effective change. You'll have more organization-wide buy-in, and you're going to have more and higher quality information. Because remember, collective change is a collaborative, iterative process of power sharing and co-designing. Now I'm going to offer some guidelines in your approach to collective change. So guideline number 1 is to practice self-reflection. This should happen even before inviting your team into collective change. Team members could perceive the process as just window dressing or just checking a box if you're not sincere about it. So in order to prevent this stumbling block, the leader or leadership team really needs to do some earnest self-reflection. You need to build trust by being honest. So have you really made a decision or not? Are you really open to hearing alternative ideas? Are you ready to hear about the challenges to your proposed change? Is there space in the change for others to directly inform the outcome? And if the answer is no, you need to be honest about that. You need to be clear on what parts are and what parts aren't open to input. So an example might be, you've decided to hire a COO. And after doing some self-reflection, you really don't think your mind's going to change about that. So don't ask your team to engage in a performative process of collective change about what the organizational staffing structure should be. You've already really honestly decided. But perhaps you'd want to engage them in designing the roles and responsibilities of the position that you've already decided should be hired. Guideline number 2 is ensure staff and stakeholders understand the need for change. This goes back to one of our considerations. Make sure you've presented the case. So for example, it might be something like, look, we can't sustain this organization financially the same way that we've been operating. Or programmatically, while we may really like what we're doing, we aren't meeting our participation targets, our funding goals, or seeing the impact we set out to achieve. Because again, before you can get staff to accept or invest in it, it's really helpful if they understand it. Guideline number 3 is to frame expectations. Name it that you're going into a space where there's going to be a lot of ambiguity. So some helpful phrases might be like, this is just an idea. I haven't fully fleshed this out yet. A decision hasn't yet been made. Now, again, in this process, trust is important, so they need to believe you when you say those things. So I have another really quick story. About 9 months ago, I presented a pretty wild opportunity to my team, who I will say is really wonderful, quite flexible and open-minded. We're a social services agency, and for reasons I won't dive into right now, we have this opportunity to host a young emerging Djibouti-based Somali rapper and vocalist for a community project, an artist residency here in Minneapolis. Now, this involved negotiating a contract between languages, securing a visa, contacting congressional offices, building a resume, filling out 782 forms, engaging local artists to perform with him, securing venues, selling tickets, and we're a social services agency. This is way different from anything we've ever considered doing at this organization before. So when I presented this to my staff, I could just see everybody like deer in headlights. What is she talking about? And I even went so far as to say, maybe we could bring him to different cities and we could do a tour. And the anxiety went from like 0 to 5,000. So it was really helpful in that minute to be really clear that I'm just throwing out crazy ideas here. Nothing's been decided. I'm not saying this is what we're doing. It's an opportunity. So we are hosting this artist. He's arriving on Sunday. We just found out this morning that his visa was approved. His name's Sean Boy. Look him up. He has 130 million views across his YouTube platforms. We're not sending him on tour. So, and perhaps most importantly, going on to guideline number 4, bring staff and stakeholders into the process early, which is what I did with this really wild opportunity that I presented to my staff 9 months ago. Inviting team members in early to help design is ultimately going to result in more acceptance and investment, but it has its difficulties. There are some challenges with inviting people in early that are important to be aware of. One is that stakeholders have anxiety about change. The stakeholders are going to have a lot of questions that the leader probably doesn't have the answer to, and purposely so, because you're inviting them into a process where you're going to answer those questions together, the ones that they're currently asking you. And finally, the stakeholders are still going to want certainty. People crave certainty, but they also want to be involved before certainty is established. So it makes for kind of a tricky situation to navigate. Another really quick challenge I'll mention with collective change and early involvement is that staff in particular tend to filter proposals for change through the work they do, not as it pertains to the entire organization. That often leads to fear of increased work for them, changes in their own role, new accountability for them personally. So it's important to encourage them to, through this process, think about change organizationally. So my hope is that following some of those guidelines, or following some of these guidelines, will help avoid some of these challenges that are really involved. So going back to some guidelines, we can also create a culture of continuous change. This means setting an expectation that you're running towards instead of from change. Change is a part of how you do business. that your goal is not to create the perfect program or service or product and then you just do that forever, but rather the goal is inherently contingent. As needs and community change, you change with it. This also ensures that the organization isn't over-investing in one idea or the other. And to create a culture of change, of course, you can also start hiring differently. You can look to hire folks who are more flexible and adaptable with the understanding that they have an ever-shifting portfolio. And finally, come back to the mission. Returning to the organizational mission and values is important to remember when you're embarking on especially significant change. And if the current programs or approach aren't fulfilling the mission, vision, or intended impact, it's not only okay but necessary to embark on change. So kind of going back to my example from before, our mission at GMCC is very vague. It's uniting people of faith and serving people in need, which is kind of challenging because there's not a really clear blueprint moving forward, but it's also really exciting because it means that it's really flexible. And there were a number of reasons why hosting the Somali Wrapper for a community event did fit in the mission and values. It fit financially because it came with secured funding already. It provided an opportunity to engage new communities who might then sign up for our other more sustainable programs. There's some youth-focused work involved that is a really engaging curriculum for our young people, and it presents an interesting opportunity for interfaith and multicultural community gathering. So now I'll move on to the phases of engaging in change. You can really reduce levels of uncertainty that come with change by articulating a structure or process for the change. So phase one is data collection. That's when you're receiving and giving input on all the current problems and aspirations. You're providing numbers. You're offering the reality of the financial statements maybe. Invite your team to input data you may not be aware of. Answer questions, listen to counter arguments. Phase two is what I call creative ambiguity. And this phase is sort of a process of radical brainstorming. And again, setting expectations about, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in this phase. It includes questioning assumptions, interrogating the mission, maybe even, re-envisioning how the work is done and who does what. But because of the high level of uncertainty in this phase, it is important to define a timeline. So we're going to do this, we're going to grapple with this for a week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever it might be. And helpful questions in this phase might be, well, how do you think we could address that? Or, well, what do you recommend in order to get that conversation going? And even in this phase, folks are going to function with certain limitations. They might jump forward to the planning and implementation phase, which is okay and efficient. They're not going to come up with ideas like that would require the organization to secure $1 billion, for example, because that's, of course, unlikely to happen. And phase three, vision and strategy. That's really about making choices. What is the vision going forward? What are the strategic level decisions we have to make? What will we do? What won't we do? Again, these are discussions and collaborative decisions. Phase four is the planning. How are we going to do these things? What are the logistics? And finally, phase five, the implementation. Again, it's just helpful to have kind of a defined process in order to reduce levels of anxiety and uncertainty and effectively invite people in for collective change. So quickly in conclusion, so what worked for me when embarking on pretty radical change with the team is assessing the stakeholders' investment in the current programming and using and acknowledging that information, engaging staff and stakeholders early on in the process, creating a culture and an expectation of continuous change, and setting a timeline in a process. Some of the things that didn't work were designing in isolation, presenting a fully baked idea. So going back to my story from the very beginning, I developed and proposed a racial justice framework to my stakeholders. What I maybe should have done is invited people into that conversation, ask questions, instead of just presenting this fully baked framework. What also doesn't work is reaching conclusions before you're asking for input or saying you want input when you really don't want input. So hopefully some of these guidelines and a set process will help when you are looking to bring a team into accepting and investing in change and embarking on a phase of some pretty significant change for your organization or business.
Thank you so much.
Hey, my friend, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, be sure to rate, review, and share your biggest takeaway. And if you're wanting more, you can access hundreds of recent speakers, book summaries, great articles, and more at no additional charge through your membership portal. You can also get involved in a Women Leaders Association mastermind group or networking group near you. Or if you just need to access your membership portal, simply go to womenleaderspodcast.com to be connected. Because here at Women Leaders Association, we believe we go further, faster, and have more fun when we go together. That's all for today, my friends. Bye for now.